Okay, well, what a pleasure to be here. And I really enjoyed spending time with you all yesterday. And so I feel like I got a little bit of an advance chance to kind of give you my perspective on this. And so, yes, I have an initiative. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and we work on narratives for peace. And because language is so important, I feel the need to kind of clarify when we say narratives for peace. And I'm actually in the game right now of trying to rebrand what does peace mean to people.
Mm,
You all might say to yourself, well, yeah, that's interesting. I'm definitely into peace too, but I don't really work on peace. I'm not living in a conflict environment. I'm not necessarily actively kind of working against war in Yemen. I don't really see myself in that word. And I want to say our Narratives for Peace initiative takes a much broader perspective of peace and peace building. So when we talk about peace, we talk about positive peace. That's a very academic term. We have negative peace and positive peace. There's the absence of violence, there's the absence of threat of violence, and then there's all of the ways that we keep societies peaceful. And democratic governance and human rights, access to information, economic development, all of these factors help to keep societies peaceful. And so, part of what our Narratives Initiative is trying to accomplish is to broaden an umbrella of understanding of who is actually working for peace and how are they doing their work. Um, Now, with that said, then, if my work is as a peace builder, I feel that my work around narrative engagement actually starts with me. And it starts with the people who are trying to make the change in the world. So I love this Rumi quote because I think social justice activists, the quote unquote social justice warriors out there in the world, and if you don't know, in the United States, that can be seen as a derogatory term. If you're a social justice warrior, there's a lot of people that roll their eyes at you. And sometimes I think this need for self reflection about how I need to change myself and I need my own self reflection in order to then be able to do the work on engaging with narratives is one of the most important lessons. And I want to hold ourselves to a higher standard because we're trying to be in the world as peace builders with that broad umbrella, and all of that includes. So I am the CEO of Partners Global. We're based in Washington, D.C. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary. We came out of the democracy building movement of 1989. So when the fall of the Berlin Wall fell and there was a rush of activity to support that transition to democratic institutions, we started investing in local affiliates in Central and Eastern Europe, a little bit of a franchise model. Partners Poland, Partners Bulgaria, Partners Hungary, Partners Czech Republic, Partners uh, Slovakia. We now have 20 of those affiliates around the world. They are completely independent local organizations and they form the Partners Network. So I am not in the business anymore of setting up affiliates. We have a robust network. We're working in over 50 countries. But what I do want to say is that this call for working on narrative engagement bubbled up from my network. So previous to 2016, we started reflecting on what was happening in Central and Eastern Europe, that the values of liberal democracy and membership in the European Union were coming into question. Our colleagues in Central America and throughout Latin America were saying we're working on human rights, and yet somehow the values of human rights are being questioned, and the hard security, mano dura, is winning out in the public conversation at this point. And we're very good at dialogue, we're very good at citizen engagement. We bridge conflict resolution, peace building, we make sure that citizens have a voice, and yet somehow the techniques we're using don't seem to be sufficient for us to be able to battle these values challenges. And we actually didn't even know what to call it back then. We didn't know to call it narrative engagement. But we've held a goal for ourselves to develop new tools in our toolbox, which then led us to our Narratives for Peace initiative. And so I wanted to just highlight a couple of key learnings for me because I personally, this was a presidential initiative. I went on my own learning journey around narrative engagement, and I use that term purposefully. I don't talk about narrative change,
Hmm.
and some of you were in a small group with me yesterday and heard me say that. Is I think narrative change indicates something, you're wrong and I'm right, and I need to change your mind. And I want to engage with narratives. Um, I want to respect different worldviews. And so that led me to a school of thought around narratives, which is narrative and conflict. So there's a school at George Mason University, um, which is in Virginia, fairly close to Washington, D.C., that has an institute on narrative and conflict resolution. And so a lot of my research really was grounded in, well, how is narrative engagement being applied to conflict situations? And not just interpersonal conflicts, because there's narrative identities, there's a way of like family therapy. You can talk
Mhm.
through your stories and try and come to resolution. But we are dealing with societal conflicts right now that are manifesting through the stories that have since the day humans were on this planet. And there's a whole field of study for over 30 years, more so, that has been unfolding. So, what were my key ahas when, and because I had to do a lot of trying to translate this very dense academic research to anything that could be practical to me. And so, one of the things, and Jay absolutely kind of jumped the gun to say, you narratives is a way of making meaning of the world, and we use it so interchangeably to talk about kind of how we're crafting stories and strategic communications. But when I think about the way that human beings make sense of the world are the stories that we tell ourselves as individuals, the stories that we tell ourselves about the communities that we live in, the way we filter the information is through stories. So if I think about sense making, that helps me. But the other thing that helps me is that meaning is made in the mind of the receiver of whatever communication it is. I am not making meaning for you. And so that old model of strategic communications, I have something to say. I'm going to make sure that it gets to you in a really creative way so I can keep your attention, or that somehow I'm going to protect the message so that it gets to you in the way I intended it to get to you. That person will make meaning of that message based on their own narratives,
Mm.
understandings. And so that then makes me think that I have my own cognitive biases. Me as the sender, what absolutely makes perfect sense to me is not going to make perfect sense to you. So if I'm going to engage in narrative work in the public sphere, I've got to remember that not everybody thinks like me, which then therefore means when I think about my narrative strategies, I'm not going to group a bunch of people who think exactly like me to come up with what my meta narrative is for my campaign. And so, what are like my three main messages then when I am with my groups and my coalitions? Because I am, we work in coalition. Partners Global is committed to collective action. And a lot of us feel that sense of urgency to be working collectively on campaigns. But do we take the time to be self reflective of our own cognitive biases? Do we stop and
Mm.
think, this feels really good to me? Why does it feel good to me? Why are these the stories that I feel the most comfortable in? Because then do I have curiosity of other narratives? Am I aware of what those narratives are? We just looked at two different Democratic politicians um, who are progressive and who are liberal and who probably share a worldview of most of the people in this room. And where I'm not criticizing the fact that you didn't have, Mitch McConnell up there. That's totally fine. And yet, we do need to explore maybe there are autocratic politicians out there that are manipulating the public conversation in the countries where many of you work. And yet, there are many, many people in those communities that are buying into a narrative who have a lived experience. There has to be curiosity about that. And then finally, is my goal to change a narrative? Is it to have a stronger, more powerful narrative? what I've learned from the people who work in conflict is that one of my calls is to complexify the narrative. And I love the term that Sarah Cobb wrote a book, and I can't remember the book title now, but Sarah Cobb, COBB, she talks about narrative braiding so that you can have your narrative and your understanding and your identity, and I can have mine, and we're going to braid those together, and we're going to hopefully come out with an understanding of a place that we can both feel comfortable with moving forward. So then finally, this feeds into a broader civil society resilience. On the break or at the reception, I could talk all day about civil society resiliency. And then finally, this feeds into for us a new advocacy approach, which is a restorative advocacy approach. I think some of us who are working for social change are unwittingly contributing to the increased polarization in our societies. And partially, it's through our communications efforts. And not only are we causing harm, um, or maybe not even bringing the right allies to our side, but we're further polarizing the societies and we're looking at new tools for advocacy that's more restorative. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's really been a joy to spend these time with you, and I really look forward to hearing from the other panels.
Wow, thank you, Julia. Let's yes, please.